Mother Rasputin, the Mariam Soulakiotis story. In the hills outside Athens, Greece, where ancient pine trees cast long shadows over the Attica landscape, a monastery once stood as a beacon of hope for the sick and desperate. The Panagia Pefkovounogiatrissa Monastery, the convent of the Virgin in the Pines, promised salvation to those suffering from tuberculosis, offering free treatment in its high-altitude retreat. But between 1939 and 1950, this sanctuary would become something far more sinister. This is the story of Abbess Mariam Soulakiotis, a woman the Greek press would come to know by a chilling nickname, Mother Rasputin. Born around 1883 in the small town of Karatea, Marina Soulakiotis began life as a simple factory worker. Her childhood home at number 71 Megalou Alexandrou Street would later become part of the very monastery where her dark legacy would unfold. Little is known about her early years, but by the 1920s, Marina had found her calling in the Greek Orthodox Church, taking the religious name Mariam and embracing the life of a nun. The year 1923 marked a pivotal moment in Greek Orthodox history. The mainstream Greek Orthodox Church adopted the new calendar, aligning with the Gregorian calendar used by much of the world. This decision sparked fierce opposition among traditionalists who clung to the old Julian calendar. These old calendarists viewed the change as a betrayal of Orthodox tradition, and among their most devoted followers was Sister Mariam. In 1927, Mariam found her spiritual mentor in Archbishop Matthew Karpathakis of Resthena, an elderly bishop who had broken away from both the mainstream church and even other old calendarist groups. Together, they established the Panagia Pefkovounogiatrissa monastery on land between Karatea and the village of Kakithalassa. Officially founded to honor the presentation of the Virgin Mary, the monastery had another purpose: to provide financial support for Matthew's breakaway religious movement. The monastery's acquisition raises questions that remain unanswered to this day. Historical records show that Mariam purchased additional plots of land in 1925, 7 acres in April, followed by 2 more plots later that year. Yet even sympathetic accounts of the monastery's history cannot explain how the nuns obtained the substantial funds needed for these expensive property purchases. By 1938, the monastery had begun marketing itself as something unprecedented: a free tuberculosis treatment center. In an era when tuberculosis was a death sentence for many, particularly the poor, this seemed like a divine blessing. The monastery's high-altitude location in the pine-covered hills was believed to offer natural healing benefits for lung ailments. Desperate families and wealthy individuals alike began making pilgrimages to this remote sanctuary, seeking miracle cures. But there was a crucial detail that visitors might not have initially understood. The monastery offered no actual medical treatment. No doctors were permanently stationed there. No modern medicines were administered. The treatment consisted entirely of staying at the high-altitude location and following strict ascetic practices prescribed by the nuns. As Archbishop Matthew aged, his health began to deteriorate, particularly during World War II. The elderly bishop, already 78 by 1939, spent increasing amounts of time away from the monastery, either imprisoned for his religious activities or pursuing extreme ascetic practices. He would tie heavy metal chains to his body, undergo 40-day fasts, and isolate himself in deprived cells, seeking spiritual rewards through physical suffering. This left the day-to-day operations of the monastery entirely in Mariam's hands. While she wouldn't officially become abbess until 1950, she had been functioning in that role since 1939, wielding absolute authority over the growing community of nuns, monks, and visitors. Her influence over the aging Matthew grew exponentially, particularly as his health failed in 1950. According to prosecutors, it was during this period that Mariam developed her deadly system. Beginning in 1940, after establishing complete control over the monastery, she allegedly began sending monks across Greece to seek out wealthy widows, spinsters, and families who might be converted to their cause. The promise was always the same: join our holy community and find peace and healing. Reuters reported that by the time of her arrest, Mariam had amassed an extraordinary fortune: 300 homes and farms across the country, along with gold and jewels worth thousands of pounds, equivalent to hundreds of thousands in today's currency. The alleged method was always similar: encourage wealthy women to join the convent, then use torture, starvation, and psychological manipulation to force them to donate their entire fortunes to the monastery. The prosecution would later detail a horrifying pattern of abuse. Wealthy converts who tried to leave the monastery found themselves confined in isolation cells, sometimes in quarters previously used by tuberculosis patients. They were subjected to beatings, starvation, and psychological torture until they surrendered their property deeds. Once the money was transferred, many of these victims would simply disappear. One survivor, Eugenia Margetti, testified that she was held in an isolation cell and tortured until she surrendered property worth 118 million drachmas, equivalent to nearly $1 million in today's money. Those seeking tuberculosis treatment faced an equally grim fate. Of the estimated 500 people who willed their property to the monastery and subsequently died there, prosecutors argued this was an unusually high number for any legitimately operated religious institution. The first crack in Mariam's operation came from an unexpected source, the daughter of a wealthy woman who had left everything to the monastery. She contacted police with accusations of blackmail and threats, insisting her mother would never have willingly given away her fortune. This anonymous complaint would set in motion an investigation that would eventually expose the full scope of the monastery's crimes. The investigation gained international attention when the FBI became involved in the case of Simela Spirides, an 18-year-old Greek-American from Toledo, Ohio, who had gone missing in 1949. The FBI traced her to the monastery, and her father accused a nun named Mariam Zafriopoulos of luring his daughter to Greece with promises related to property worth $10,000 that had been left to the monastery. On the night of December 4, 1950, more than 85 police officers surrounded the monastery grounds. Accompanied by a deputy prosecutor, a judge, and a coroner, they conducted an overnight operation that would shock even experienced law enforcement officials. Upon entering the compound, they forcibly removed 36 children from the premises, having to wrestle them away from nuns who refused to let them go. But the children were not the most disturbing discovery. Police found several half-naked, malnourished elderly women tied up in basement cells. The quality of food served to residents was appalling, and the overall conditions spoke to systematic abuse and neglect. Despite the horrific conditions, the initial charges filed against Mariam were relatively minor: illegal export of olive oil to Cyprus and illegal import of tires. The prosecutors needed time to build their more serious cases. As more evidence came to light, the charges against Mariam were repeatedly revised and expanded. In February 1951, she and 13 other nuns and monks were indicted on charges including homicide, fraud, forgery of wills, blackmail, and torture. Mariam received the harshest indictment of all. The timing was significant. That same month, all old calendarist sects in Greece were officially outlawed. During her trials, Mariam presented a striking figure. She wore the most conservative form of Orthodox nun's habit, with a black epanokalamavkion that completely covered her forehead and eyebrows. Around her neck, she wore an Orthodox icon depicting the deceased Archbishop Matthew, whom her followers venerated as Saint Matthew the New Confessor. The prosecution detailed 7 specific murders that they could prove beyond doubt. The case of the Baca family exemplified Mariam's methods. A couple with 3 children had voluntarily joined the monastery and surrendered their considerable wealth. When Mrs. Baca realized the terrible conditions and attempted to leave with her children, Mariam condemned her to 6 months of solitary confinement in a tuberculosis-contaminated cell with minimal food. When she emerged, Mrs. Baca fell into a coma and died. Her husband subsequently met the same fate. The Panagia Pefkovounogiatrissa couple were forced to sign over their home before dying of starvation within the monastery walls. Ms. Mikalakou, seeking treatment for tuberculosis, was locked in a cell where she died after signing over her property, never having seen a doctor or received any medical care. Even nuns within the community were not safe. Sister Theodote and Sister Maria were both beaten to death on Mariam's orders as punishment for alleged misconduct. Mariam's attorney, Panos Panayotakos, mounted a defense that focused on traditional monastic practices. He argued that surrendering material property upon joining a monastery was standard practice, a vow of poverty taken by all who entered religious life. He claimed the properties were registered in Mariam's name simply because there was no legal corporate entity for the monastery. In a surprising turn, the defense produced a letter allegedly from Field Marshal Harold Alexander, thanking the monastery's clergy for heroically helping British soldiers escape during the Axis occupation of Greece during World War II. Whether this letter was authentic, or how it related to the murder charges, was never clearly established. Throughout her trials, Mariam remained defiant, adamantly denying all charges until her death. She dismissed the accusations as satanic fictions and accepted her sentences without emotion, only crossing herself and offering what witnesses described as a prayer of vengeance to her beloved Saint Matthew. Even as evidence mounted against her, Mariam retained a devoted following. At the peak of her power, more than 400 people lived in the monastery complex. In 1951, after her arrest, her followers marched in protest, demanding that their leaders be returned to them. The situation became so tense that police had to protect the home of Archbishop Spiridon, as authorities believed the old calendarists were planning to kidnap him as leverage for Mariam's release. Mariam received 3 separate sentences over her trials: 26 months in 1951 to 52, 10 years concurrent in 1953, and an additional 4 years consecutive later that same year. The total of 14 years was, given her age, effectively a life sentence. She died in Averof prison on November 23, 1954, at the age of 71, before all of her criminal trials could be completed. After her death, she was buried on the monastery grounds, near the grave of Archbishop Matthew Karpathakis. But even death did not end the controversy surrounding Mariam Soulakiotis. Her religious sect continued to operate underground despite being outlawed, and as late as 1959, police were still investigating cases of young girls vanishing into thin air that they believed led back to the rebel Karatea convent. The question of Mariam's true victim count remains a matter of debate among historians. She was officially convicted of 7 premeditated murders and more than 100 negligent homicides related to her fraudulent tuberculosis treatment. The most commonly cited figure places her total victim count at 177, though some authorities claimed she had killed more than 500 people. Modern secular historians reject any possibility of her innocence, citing the overwhelming amount of witness testimony and physical evidence. However, the monastery she once controlled continues to operate to this day. As of 2022, the Panagia Pefkovounogiatrissa monastery remains active, with nuns who still believe in Mariam's innocence and venerate her as a saint and martyr. Some current members of Matthew's old calendarist movement continue to assert that Mariam was unjustly tried, claiming she was the victim of jealous male clergy or government persecution of their religious beliefs. They argue that the high death rate was simply due to the advanced age and poor health of many who came to the monastery seeking help. Greek author Nina Kolataki, in her 2019 analysis of female serial killers, suggests that Mariam's success had little to do with her specific brand of Orthodox Christianity. She argues that a cunning, manipulative leader could have achieved similar results regardless of religious affiliation, and that the Greek tabloid press used the sensational details of the case as a convenient distraction from the political chaos of the era. The case has continued to fascinate true crime enthusiasts and has been featured in multiple documentaries and television programs. In the horror drama series Grotesquerie on FX, one character names Soulakiotis as their favorite serial killer, demonstrating how her story continues to captivate audiences decades after her death. Today, visitors to the hills outside Karatea can still see the Panagia Pefkovounogiatrissa monastery, where these crimes took place. The pine trees that gave the convent its name still whisper in the Greek wind, and the high altitude that once promised healing to tuberculosis patients continues to offer sweeping views of the Attica landscape. The story of Mariam Soulakiotis serves as a chilling reminder of how religious authority can be corrupted, how desperation can make people vulnerable to exploitation, and how the promise of salvation can mask the most heinous crimes. Whether she was a serial killer who manipulated religious faith for financial gain, or a misunderstood religious leader persecuted by secular authorities, may never be definitively resolved. What remains undisputed is that between 1939 and 1950, dozens of people died under mysterious circumstances in a remote Greek monastery, their wealth transferred to an increasingly powerful abbess who wielded absolute authority over their lives and deaths. In the hills where ancient Greeks once worshipped their gods, a very modern evil had taken root, cloaked in the robes of religious devotion. This was the story of Mariam Soulakiotis, factory worker turned abbess, spiritual leader turned serial killer, a woman whose legacy continues to divide opinion nearly 70 years after her death. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her story is not the crimes themselves, but how easily faith can be weaponized, and how the most vulnerable among us can become prey to those who claim to offer salvation. Mariam Soulakiotis died in Avarov prison on November 23, 1954. She was convicted of 7 premeditated murders and more than 100 negligent homicides. The true number of her victims may never be known. This documentary is dedicated to all those who lost their lives seeking healing and found only tragedy in the hills of Karatia. In the shadows of faith and history, some stories are too chilling to forget. If this one gripped you, unsettled you, or made you think twice about blind devotion, don't let it fade into silence. Like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders as we continue exploring the strange, the sinister, and the stories that slip between the cracks of time. Until next time, keep questioning what's hidden and wondering what's next.